Welcome everyone to New HD NYC with your host Ray K. Available on all major podcast platforms and powered by New HD Media. Now here's your host, Ray K.
My next guest is one of the greatest sports authors in the U.S. and worldwide, with 10 books, #1 New York Times bestsellers. Peter has a bunch of books out, and check some of these names: Hank Aaron, Pete Rose on Hitting, Dynasty, Teammates, Red Sox Nation, Landry Boys, Tony Curtis, and of course Bronx Zoo, amongst a lot of others. It's my pleasure to introduce Peter Golenbock. Peter, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
Pleasure, Ray.
You're very welcome. Peter, let me ask you about this crazy year with COVID-19, and from your perspective. I don't know if writers, maybe they write from the house anyway, but how has this pandemic affected, your work?
Well, I think it's hurt writers everywhere, quite frankly.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we are Haslam's bookstore here in St. Petersburg. This magnificent bookstore with 100,000 books. Pretty much is closed. I mean, what happened was this. We have a book out. I did a book with Richard Painter, who was the ethicist for George W. Bush. And he came to town, and on March 12th and on March 13th, we did 3 appearances. We had a lot of people come. We signed a lot of books. And on May 15th, the COVID closed everything down. Richard and I were supposed to go on the Today Show on May 20th. Of course, that was canceled. And, we never recovered from it. So the combination of, the COVID, absolutely killing our wonderful book, American Nero was about the history of presidents who break the law. And how Trump was the worst of all of them. It's really what it was about. And we thought we were on our way. And then COVID came and closed everything down, closed all the bookstores down. It stopped our appearances on national TV because all anybody wanted to talk about was the virus.
Right.
And so that's just something that you just shake your head. There's nothing much you can do about it. And as I said, it's also shut down so many bookstores. You want to not catch this thing so you don't go wandering around stores,
right,
including bookstores.
Right.
And it's tough. It's just tough.
Is this something like this new book you were writing early in the year? Is this something that would pick up next year, or do you have to wait till this? I guess it's so unpredictable. I'm hoping by mid next year this kind of subsides, or is it still in flux? You really don't know, or do you hope next year?
I've got several friends whose books came out on the market March, April, May, and it seems to me that all people want to read about. For the most part, is people who are on television. I mean, it's the darndest thing. I mean, I really thought that with American Nero, because it was about Trump, that it would be, widely promoted. And it wasn't. But it seems like every single person who was on MSNBC or who's on Fox or who's on the Today Show, who hosts these shows, every one of these people have come out with a book. Joe Scarborough has just come out with a book on Harry Truman, and he's spending 45 minutes every day promoting his own book. Meanwhile, the rest of us are just sort of wallowing. It's hard.
So they have the built-in audience being the host of a TV show. So was it just easy? It's a celebrity thing that they're right there, so they're able to do it and get it out to the audience. Common sense, I guess.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Exactly right.
Okay. And Peter, what do you think about sports this year? I mean, I'm a huge sports fan. I was born in the '60s, so I was, a kid throughout those 70 years, which I want to talk about some of that time frame. But and I was like really into it, So I'm not as into it as much now, where I don't know every player like I used to know. But what do you think of like baseball season this year? Like, what's your opinion on this thing? To me, it had that surreal effect,
We had our rotisserie baseball season this year. Mm-hmm. And our team won the championship this year, so the thrill of that was really quite fantastic. I watched. My wife Wendy and I watched every Rays game. There were 60 of them, plus playoff games that took the Tampa Bay Rays, to the World Series. So that was very exciting.
Okay. Now you watched them on TV, right?
They wouldn't. I tried sneaking in, and they kept catching me and throwing me out.
They wouldn't even let you in there. Okay.
No, they wouldn't. They wouldn't even let me in.
Wow.
Can you imagine that?
Okay.
I know.
Okay.
And that was frustrating. I mean, I tried everything. They didn't even send their broadcasters on the road.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right.
I mean, they broadcast the games from the Trop, even though the games were in San Diego and in Texas.
Ah, okay. I was speaking to Susan Waldman from the the color announcer for the Yankees.
Susan and I used to play tennis together. We were tennis partners.
She was. She said she wasn't athletic early on playing ball, but I guess she was an athlete then, playing tennis.
She was a very good tennis player.
Okay.
Yes, she was. She and Roger Kahn and I can't remember who the fourth one was, but periodically we would play tennis up in Armonk, New York.
Oh, okay. I love the inside scoop stuff here. That's pretty cool.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Well, they were. I didn't realize that they were at every single game, even the away games. She was doing them, with John Sterling at Yankee Stadium.
That's
and,
right.
I was, I thought. I don't know if the TV guys were home. I always thought people were just home doing it, but I was shocked that she actually went in there. Only ones in the stadium. She said it was kind of eerie. It was a little bit scary during that time. No one else was there.
Absolutely eerie.
Yeah,
sure.
Yeah,
I mean, imagine how it must have been for the ball players. But very interestingly, they figured out that by adding crowd noise, that it would make it much more realistic for the fans watching it at home.
Right.
And that was quite wonderful. That was quite a brilliant notion, and I imagine it made it better for the for the players as well, to be able to hear the cheers when they did something good.
Right. Even on the 2-strike count, they had that rhythm thing going, with the 2 strikes.
That's right.
Yeah. They did it well. I was kind of wondering before the season if they were going to have not have that, and then you could hear stuff. You hear the players maybe talking, or you hear the foul ball click. Just like a batting practice, you hear the ball better.
Yeah. Right.
That might have been interesting. But I happen to like the crowd myself. I had a friend that went to.
Baseball is wonderful whether you're watching Little League, or watching a high school game, or a college game, or a pickup game. It doesn't make any difference.
Right.
It's just such a fantastic game.
Well, that's a perfect segue, because I know you're a baseball guy. Yeah. Why is baseball the best game? I hear all the different things about it. It's like most like real life. What is it to you, Peter, that makes baseball so great?
Well, I mean, it's the gene. I mean, it's the gene that you were born with.
Okay.
It's why why Catholics prefer being Catholics, and Protestants prefer being Protestants. I mean, it's just I have no idea.
Okay.
I don't know. When I was 12 years old, I went into the Stamford, Connecticut Public Library, and I found a book called The New York Yankees by Frank Graham. And I must have read that book, I don't know, 15, 20 times.
Now, how old were you now? You were a kid.
I was 12, 13 at the time.
Okay.
And there was, conversations with Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig, and hearing about Miller Huggins and Joe DiMaggio, and I was just, absolutely hooked on it.
Mm-hmm.
And oddly enough, after graduating from college and law school, and going to work at Prentice Hall as an attorney, I determined that the thing that I wanted to do was write the sequel to that book, to that New York Yankees by Frank Graham, and that's what became Dynasty. Dynasty was the sequel to that book.
Wow. Okay. So you kind of grew up in like the perfect era for a person that age. Were you a Yankee fan?
Well, let's put it this way. My first memories of baseball was in the World Series of 1954 when Willie Mays made that incredible catch off of Vic Wertz in the 1954 World Series.
Right.
Then the next thing I remember was Bannister breaking the 4-minute mile. And then after that, starting in 1955, the Yankees won the pennant. 56, they won the pennant. 57, they won the pennant. 58, they won the pennant. 60, they won the pennant. 61, they won the pennant. 62, they won the pennant. 63, they won the pennant. 64, they won the pennant. Mm-hmm. That was my childhood. How can you beat that?
Well, were you a Yankee fan?
Absolutely.
Okay. All right. If you were a Brooklyn Dodger fan, it may not have been good, But,
no. Well, I was born in Stamford, Connecticut. So I would take the New Haven Railroad into New York, get on the Lexington Avenue subway up to Yankee Stadium to go see Mickey Mantle and Whitey Ford and Roger Maris and my boys.
What year was your first game? Do you remember walking into the stadium for the first time?
No. Well, I'll tell you the first game that I do remember. Interestingly enough, my Uncle Justin, he was Jackie Robinson's lawyer.
Okay.
So, in 1956, when I was 10 years old, he took me to the fourth game of the 1956 World Series.
Whoa, okay.
And after the game, we went and I got to meet and shake hands with Jackie Robinson.
Wow, okay.
And that's sort of the other half of some of the books that I've been doing, because, of course, Bums, which was an oral history of the Brooklyn Dodgers, was one thing. And then I did a book called In the Country of Brooklyn.
Okay.
And the point of that book was I asked myself the question, why was it when Robinson came up to play in Brooklyn that everybody loved him when he was African American and the rest of the country hated him?
Okay.
And that's what that book answers that question.
So we got to read the book.
Correct? That would be nice, yeah.
Okay.
It'd be good if you read the book, sure.
Well, what's the answer? That's kind of what I'm getting at.
The answer was that Brooklyn was a very liberal community, mostly Jewish for the most part, some Italians and some Irish, but it was the Jews more than anybody else who fought for civil rights for blacks.
Okay.
Who the people I interviewed, just loved Robinson. Mm-hmm. And they loved Robinson because he was a winning baseball player. Right. And they didn't care. They didn't care whether he was black.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. When you met him, did he give off a special kind of aura? I guess as a kid, anybody may, but was there anything like you remember particular about meeting him?
I'm not sure what question you're asking me.
What was it like meeting him, basically?
Oh, like meeting him?
Yeah.
Oh, it was like meeting God. I was 10 years old, and when I shook hands with him, his hands totally, entwined mine, and I was 5'10". I must have weighed 112 pounds. He was 6 feet, 210 pounds.
Right.
I mean, and he was wearing his uniform, of course. I was totally starstruck.
Right.
And what's interesting, the other wonderful thing was when I was doing Bums, I called Rachel Robinson, Jackie's wife, to interview her. And the reason she allowed me to interview her was because my Uncle Justin was her lawyer.
Okay.
So I got my book Bums really was one of the very first books to point out that what Jackie Robinson really was the beginning of the civil rights movement. That's how important he was in American history.
Does that get stressed enough, do you think, that part of it?
Say again?
Do you think that gets mentioned, in the appropriate way?
I think it now gets mentioned. I mean, right. Consider the fact that on every April 15th, that every single ball player wears number 42 on his uniform.
Right.
That is spectacular.
Yeah.
That is absolutely spectacular.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that tells me that people now understand his importance.
Is the importance of Jackie Robinson equal? I mean, there's not too many impact players like that, right? I mean,
Nobody.
Yeah, I mean,
Nobody. Nobody ever.
Is Babe Ruth in that league as far as impact, or maybe it's just those two?
Babe Ruth is in that league for a different reason.
Okay.
Babe Ruth is in that league for a different reason. I mean, remember the Black Sox Scandal of 1919.
Right.
Everybody is going, this game is fixed. This is really awful. And then, of course, Babe Ruth comes along, 20, 21, 22, 23, hits all these home runs, and everybody forgets all about the Black Sox Scandal.
Okay.
So that was a big deal. But in terms of American history, in terms of civil rights, you could argue that Jackie Robinson may have been a more important person than Martin Luther King.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I mean, like Abraham Lincoln, like that kind of thing, like that big.
Not quite Abraham Lincoln, but
I'm kind of winging it, So I thought I'd throw that out. I mean, that was.
Abraham Lincoln did a pretty good job. Yes.
Okay.
He did all right.
How did you pick your books, Peter? How do you decide? Is it something you just like, or that you have an affinity with, or how do you pick the books you write?
It's a very, very complicated answer to that.
Okay.
When I first started out, after I wrote Dynasty, I said that Billy Martin was as important to the Yankees as Mickey Mantle and Whitey Ford, and Billy must have caught on to that because his agent called me and asked if I would write a book with Billy.
Mm-hmm.
And I said yes, of course. And then he had another client. His other client was Sparky Lyle. And with Sparky Lyle, we wrote about the 1978 Yankee season, and that was called the Bronx Zoo.
Oh, yeah.
And Sparky was such a marvelous, teller of stories that became probably the number one best-selling baseball book of all time. And then when I did my book with Billy Martin, he said enough nasty things about Steinbrenner that it too was a huge bestseller. So for quite a long while, I pretty much could write whatever baseball I wanted to write. I called Greg Nettles up and pestered the life out of him until he finally said yes, and we did a book called Balls.
Right.
I called Davey Johnson, who was the manager of the Mets, to do a book, and we did a book called Bats, which was a sort of a diary of the 1985 season, which was so much fun because I got to spend a lot of that season with the Mets and became friends with people like Gary Carter and Rusty Staub and Sid Fernandez. I just had, so much fun doing that. And then, one day I was reading USA Today and I saw a little blurb saying that in Florida they were going to start a league called the Senior Professional Baseball League. And that was going to be 8 teams, all in Florida cities, of former Major League Baseball players. And I thought to myself, wow, what a terrific idea for a book.
Mm-hmm.
And I ended up calling the guy, Jim Morley, who invented the league, and he invited me to come down and pick whichever team I wanted to write about. And so I went down to Palm Beach, and I sat with all the teams, and I picked the West Palm Beach team, which was led by Dick Williams.
Okay.
It had some great players on it. And then a day later, they called me up, and they said, "We don't want you." Because the year before, I had written a book called Personal Fouls, which was about Jim Valvano, the basketball coach at North Carolina State, and the book was about what a sort of a criminal he was.
Wait, Jim Valvano?
Yeah.
Really?
And
wow.
the book got him. The book got him fired.
I got to get it. Is it on Kindle? I'm going to get it tonight. Okay.
Yeah. Well, the book got him fired.
Whoa.
And so the PR guy for the West Palm Beach Tropics apparently was a friend of Valvano's, and he sent me a note saying, "We don't want you." So I called up Jim Morley, And Morley said, well, I'm the owner of the St. Petersburg Pelicans. Why don't you come and spend the season with us? And a couple things happened. I showed up in St. Petersburg and decided it was the most beautiful place I've ever seen in my entire life, and I've literally lived here ever since.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing that happened was that the Pelicans won the pennant, won the championship.
Right.
And I wrote a book called The Forever Boys about that. And this was in 1989-90, and this is 30 years later. It's still in print, called The Forever Boys.
Right.
And it was a chance to spend 3 months with some, wonderful, wonderful people, former baseball players. So, John Matlack, Lenny Randall. It just, goes on and on with the people I got to spend time with. It was terrific.
So it's almost like.
So how do you pick? Yeah. How do you pick these books? I mean, for a long time, after I wrote Dynasty and Bums, I then was able to write a series of team histories. So I wrote a book called Fenway, which was an oral history of the Red Sox. I did a book called The Spirit of St. Louis, which was an oral history of the St. Louis Cardinals and Browns. And I did a book called Wrigleyville, which was an oral history of the Chicago Cubs. And I did the Mets, called Amazing. And then Barnes & Noble bookstores opened all over the country, and they shut down all or most of the independent bookstores. Mm-hmm. And the problem was, if I did a book called Wrigleyville, the independent bookstores in Chicago would all order 100 books each, and I could go around from bookstore to bookstore and sign books and sell a lot of books. Mm-hmm. With Barnes & Noble, when they put the independent bookstores out of business, Barnes & Noble took 2 books. Whatever book you wrote, they would take 2 books, and that was it. And then when they sold the 2 books, they'd take 2 more books.
Oh, okay.
So that basically killed, I was hoping that I could write, 14 or 15 team histories because it was so much fun and so interesting.
Right.
But that stopped it in the tracks. As soon as that happened, publishers said, oh, no, we can't possibly only sell books in Baltimore or only sell books in Philadelphia. We can't do that. So that killed that. So I did a couple of biographies. After Billy Martin died, I did a book called Wild, High and Tight, which was his biography. I did a book with a wonderful race car driver by the name of Bobby Allison. Mm-hmm. I did his biography, and it was spectacular. I must have done 6 or 7 books on stock car racing, which I just enjoyed tremendously. Richard Petty and all of those people were so fabulous, and I got a chance to meet them all and interview them, and that was so much fun. So, your question's a complicated question.
Yeah, no,
how do I end up doing?
It's like
how do I end up doing the books that I do?
Yeah, you just however it happens, and you fall into them. It's almost like a fantasy life. You got the great skills.
I have absolutely lived a fantasy life. That's true.
Did you always have great writing skills, Peter? Even when you were like in 8th grade, did you always have that talent?
Yep.
You did. You just had the gift. Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, it was the strangest thing. When I was a freshman at Dartmouth, I started working on the Dartmouth newspaper. And as a freshman, I was writing the varsity football games.
Okay.
Which was fairly amazing. I'm not quite sure why they even let me do it, but they did. And when I was at Dartmouth, I was writing for the New York Times and for the Boston Globe.
And then you became a lawyer for, I guess, a short amount of time.
I did.
Right.
I graduated from NYU Law School. Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And what was fun about that is coming from Stanford, which was down the road about, 75 miles. A good friend of mine was the sports editor of the Stanford Advocate. And I made a deal with him. He gave me credentials. So I was the staff reporter from the Stanford Advocate to write about the Yankees, the Mets, the Knicks, the Rangers, whatever sports teams were around. The Rangers, that's who else? The Jets, the Giants, the New York Giants. So I could basically go to whatever sporting event I wanted. And on the weekend, I would write him a column. So I interviewed O.J. Simpson. I interviewed, all sorts of these players. And I just had so much fun. And one of my classmates was a friend of Phil Jackson's. And so during this time, Phil and I became actually very close friends.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And I spent a tremendous amount of time watching Knicks basketball while I was in law school. And I got to see them win the championship in 70, and I got to see them again in 73. That, the great Willis Reed game where he came off the bench and scored 2 baskets and led them to victory.
Right.
And I was in the Garden for that.
Okay.
It was just fantastic. My law school career consisted of a lot of time at Yankee Stadium, Shea Stadium, and Madison Square Garden.
Well, it must have been crazy when Willis came out of that locker room. Was it like, it must have been bedlam, right? When he walked out of there into the court.
Oh,
yeah.
Oh my gosh, it was something, because he was fairly seriously injured, and nobody was sure whether or not Willis was going to play or not. And he came out of that locker room, and the place went nuts. And then he scored the first 2 baskets of the game.
Right. And
that's all. It was over. The game was over at that point. It was over.
I think the Lakers. I've seen photos of them watching Willis, right, warming up. I mean, they just kind of stopped, and I think it might have been over then. From what I remember seeing on TV.
It could be.
Yeah.
It could be.
And Wilt never came out either, right? Wilt never covered him. It was kind of weird. He kind of stayed in the lane, Yeah.
And the other amazing thing about that, how many years ago was 1973? The Knicks haven't come close to winning a championship since.
Right.
So what's that, 27 years? 37
30,
years?
40, maybe.
Plus 20?
Yeah,
I don't know. It's more than 50 years ago.
It's going high. Yeah.
Yeah.
People don't realize back then, I was, as I said, I was a 70s kid, so I was a crazy fan. I don't think people realize the rivalry of the Celtics and the Knicks back then, how huge that was. You remember that, how big that rivalry was with Havlicek and Bradley and, the Cowens?
It was
sick, right?
Absolutely fabulous.
Yeah.
It was fabulous. I mean, it's funny. You're asking me how do you do books. So actually, Dave, I went up to Maine, to Sebago Lake, to go see Dave Cowens to do a book with Dave.
Oh wow!
And we sat and we talked for about 2 hours. And at the end of the 2 hours, I'm asking him very personal questions, because that's what allows you to sell books to publishers.
Right.
And at the end of the 2 hours, he said, I really, really enjoyed this, but it's much too public. It's just not something that I want to do. Mm-hmm. And so we never did it.
Well, you got to love a guy that takes like half the year off to drive a taxi cab and sleeps in it.
That's right.
Yeah.
No, that's exactly right. No, right.
Yeah.
Right.
I reacted like that with Cowens because I was a big Celtics fan back then. I listened to every game with Johnny Most, and those early years, he was something else. The way he leaped, and he had some charisma, and that was some team. It was just
I graduated from Dartmouth in '67, and I was the sports editor of the Dartmouth. And so it's the 7th game of the championship game. It's in the Boston Gardens. So I call up the PR guy of the of the Celtics. And he was a Dartmouth grad. So I said to him, my roommate and I would like to come down and see the game. He said to me, it's sold out, but don't worry, you come down and I'll take care of you. Mm-hmm. So we drove down to the game. He gave us 2 folding chairs and sat them behind the 30-second clock. Huh. And that's how we watched the final game of the NBA championship.
Wow.
I know it.
And that was the game the Knicks won, right? They beat them in the Garden that year, I think.
No, this was not at the Garden. This was a game in Boston Garden.
Right.
And I'm sure this was during the time when the Celtics won every year.
Okay.
This was part of Russell's reign.
Right.
No, the Celtics, on this day, the Celtics won, I guarantee you.
I was only in there a few times, and that was some place to watch a game, It was just like, you're right on top of the crowd,
and Red Auerbach would sit there, and at the end of the game, if they won, he'd pull out a cigar and smoke it.
The obnoxiousness, it seemed to work for
I
him,
love that. Yeah, I absolutely love it. Well, see, Doggy Julian, who had been a coach in the NBA. he also had coached it at Holy Cross, but he was our basketball coach at Dartmouth. And so one of his close friends was Bob Cousy.
Mm-hmm.
And Cousy would come up and visit, and I was, close enough with Doggy that I would sit with him and Cousy, the three of them, as we watched basketball practice. It was a lot of fun. And come to think of it, our athletic director at Dartmouth was Red Rolfe.
Okay.
Red Rolfe, who'd been the third baseman for the Yankees.
Yeah, way back.
During the 30s and 40s.
Right.
And I adored this guy. I absolutely adored him because if you remember when I read, the New York Yankees by Frank Graham, Red Rolfe was part of that crew.
Okay.
And what was interesting is that all of the coaches wanted Red Rolfe to quit because he was, I guess, too old or something like that. And so I, being on the newspaper, I would write laudatory articles about Red Rolfe, and he just loved that.
Mm-hmm.
He did. And the joy that I got out of writing those stories about Red Rolfe carried over when I started to do Dynasty and write about these other Yankees.
Did you, we're bouncing around. Let me just ask you quick on this one, and I'll leave basketball. Russell or Chamberlain? Who do you go with on, who's better?
Those are foolish questions, quite frankly. Because
okay.
you would take either of them.
I like that.
You would take either of them.
Okay.
I watched these people play, and I was just in awe of both of them.
Okay.
Chamberlain.
It's an interesting little argument, though. You got to admit that.
He may have been the greatest athlete who ever lived, Wilt Chamberlain.
Right.
He was absolutely amazing. One year he scored 50 points a game.
Mm-hmm.
One game he scored 100 points in a game.
Right.
Against the Knicks. He always led the league in rebounding and often in assists. He was a spectacular player. Russell had both a spectacular coach in Auerbach and a marvelous cast of characters around him.
Right.
So it's hard to know. I mean, if Russell had played with the crew from Philadelphia and Chamberlain had played with the crew from the Celtics, who would have won? I mean, it's you can argue.
Yeah.
That Chamberlain would have won with those people.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So to say who was a better player, it's almost silly.
Well, it's not automatic for Chamberlain then, right? I mean, it's something you got to just say both are great. It's not Chamberlain versus Nate Thurman.
No. You'd say you'd say both were spectacular.
Yeah. Right.
Absolutely spectacular. No.
And he I met him twice, and he just seemed bigger than he was. I know he was 7'1", but he just seemed like he was like 7'7". He just seemed. I don't know. Didn't he seem so huge? Yeah.
He seemed like he touched the sky.
Yeah.
He was. And you know what? He was a very sweet man. He was a lovely, lovely person. Can you imagine if he had been sort of an angry, bellicose guy?
Right.
Oh my goodness, he'd have killed somebody.
He seemed like an underdog type guy. That he was for the underdog. That's what my feeling always was. Wilt, Just
my feeling was always that he was the overdog.
No, I mean he liked the underdog. Like if a kid came up to him, he couldn't turn him down for an autograph. He seemed to have a soft heart.
He had a soft heart.
Yeah,
that's just who he was.
Yeah.
No, he was lovely.
Right.
Absolutely lovely.
Well, Russell, you got to, he wouldn't sign autographs. He seemed like a little bit of a tougher type persona.
He was much tougher.
Yeah.
He was much. He couldn't stand fools.
Okay.
You ask him a stupid question, he'd look at you, and go, "What kind of stupid question is that?"
Okay.
Russell was that kind of guy. Russell was. Of all the players who ever played, Russell's in the pantheon. He is certainly in my Mount Rushmore of players. Bill Russell.
Well, you think that he's the smartest, the Einstein of basketball players is kind of,
among other skills. He was just
that high.
Stupendous.
Okay.
Oh yeah.
Did you on your book writing with the Dynasty, Peter? Did you meet Joe Dimaggio and talk about that with him?
That's a very interesting question. He avoided writers like the plague. And he avoided them because he was always afraid that somebody would ask him about his marriage to Marilyn Monroe.
Okay.
And so I went to San Francisco and I sat in Dimaggio's restaurant and I talked to his older brother. But clearly there was no way that Joe was going to talk to me. I did have the chance to, be with him several times during Old Timers Day games when he was there. He was a very serious, sort of no-nonsense. He was comfortable with his friends and cold to anybody he didn't know.
Right.
He just wanted to be basically left alone.
I asked that because I knew someone that knew him. This guy owned the Italian Tribune in North Jersey, and he hung out with Joe. Joe would be in his boxer shorts watching TV, and
wow.
He never asked him. And I'm trying to find someone that would ask him about what was Lou Gehrig like playing with him. Joe never really elaborated on that because that would have been a pretty wild thing to hear, from his lips. What was Lou Gehrig like, playing with him? But I never heard it.
Well, Lou Gehrig was a very interesting character. Lou Gehrig, strangely enough, was a mama's boy.
Right. Okay.
His story I've always found very, very interesting because he would go out with these women and get close to marrying them, and his mother would say, "You can't marry her,"
wow.
And that would end their relationship until they got to Eleanor, where the mother was going to do that again, and Joe. What Joe did is he basically ran off to Long Island and had the wedding without his mother.
So it's like the movie. It was accurate prior to the Yankees, and the mother was overbearing. In the movie.
Oh, the mother was incredibly overbearing. It just was terrible. It was he was a very strange man. Lou Gehrig was a very, very strange man. Yeah, he and Babe got into it. A little bit too.
Strange.
He and Babe got it.
Oh, okay, because they were so opposite.
No, one time, Gehrig's wife had criticized Babe's wife for treating one of their children better than the other child.
Oh, okay.
And the wife became upset about that, and so Lou and Babe didn't talk for 3 or 4 years, something like that.
Okay. Well, you see clips of the home run.
Dimaggio, I talked about Dimaggio with Phil Rizzuto at great length, and he told me basically Dimaggio kept to himself. He was going through a divorce somewhere in the 30s, and he would sit on the train and smoke a cigarette all by himself. The night that he broke, how many games? 56 games in a row he got hits in 56 games in a row. So in the 57th game he was in Cleveland, and he hit ground balls to the third baseman who made 2 great plays, and so they got him out all that game, breaking his streak at 56 games. And basically Dimaggio went over to Rizzuto and said, can I borrow $20?
You go on.
I want to go and sit in the corner and have dinner. And Rizzuto basically said to him, can I come with you? Would you like some company? And Dimaggio said, no.
Okay.
No, I'll do it on my own. Dimaggio was basically kind of a loner during that time.
So him and Lou were sort of similar in a way, then with that way of being, quiet, loner types. That's interesting, From Babe Ruth
who was...
Lou Gehrig was a loner too, I would imagine, right? He seemed like a quiet type guy like Joe.
Yes, yeah. Lou Gehrig used to go to the amusement park and ride the roller coaster, and the person he would take with him was his mother.
All right, yeah. That's different. That's different.
That's different.
That's different.
That's definitely different. Yeah.
Now you're a historian, Peter. I always, I don't consider myself a historian, but I love, as a kid I used to follow this stuff like crazy, and his stats were I don't think for 10 or 12 years, his stats might be as good as anybody's, right, Gehrig, for that run he had. If you look at every single
year.
Yeah. Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. The fact if you look at Ruth's stats and look at Gehrig's stats, the fact that both of those guys were on the same team, that's just awesome. It's just incredible.
Could the player?
They were both.
No, yeah, I didn't mean to cut you on that.
All right.
I have the arguments that the stats were skewed a little bit back then because the pitchers weren't as good as now. The fielding wasn't as good. The gloves weren't as good. So the players' stats were like beefed up a little bit more. So it's hard to compare the generations on just stats because baseball seems to be a statistic type game. What are your thoughts on that? Are they kind of like skewed higher?
Well, of course.
Okay.
Of course. I mean, look. There was not an African American player in baseball until 1947.
Right.
How about that?
Right.
How about not having to play against all those incredible players in the Negro leagues?
Right.
I mean, come on.
Right. Do you think that would have affected it? I mean, would the great players still have been great though?
Oh yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Great players are great. I mean, there's just no two ways about it. And the eras are all different. I mean, people say, "Oh, these people, they take steroids. They shouldn't be in the Hall of Fame." That's just nuts. Barry Bonds was the greatest ball player who ever played. Period.
Mm-hmm.
Period. Mm-hmm. Guy was unbelievable. So, or Roger Clemens won 7 Cy Youngs. Mm-hmm. You're going to take that away from him? No. The guy from his era. This was an era. It was the steroid era.
Right.
Everybody took steroids. Everybody. Mm-hmm. So you take them as they come, and you look at the stats and go, "Oh, this guy was fantastic."
Do you vote, Peter, for Cooperstown? You one of the writers that vote at all? Or?
I have never been given a vote.
Okay.
Not ever, ever. You have to be a newspaper reporter, and I was a newspaper. I was on the Bergen Record for 2.5 years before I left to write the Bronx Zoo with Sparky Lyle.
Okay. You might have made a good decision there, So,
I love newspaper reporting. I had so much fun. I've never had as much fun on a job as I did working at the Bergen Record. We had wonderful people there. We made great newspapers. It's funny. I've got Facebook friends of some of these people who I worked with back then, and that was 1977, 1978.
The great thing about these times with Facebook and all the social media, you connect with people like your old high school friends and that you haven't seen in 35 years, and then you're like best friends again,
It's really neat.
Yeah,
it really is.
Yeah.
And also people around the country who I've admired for years, other writers who I've really admired who have become friends. It's very nice.
Well, I have to ask you this, Peter. I won't ask any more Hall of Fame questions. I'd really love to hear. I know you were probably asked about 500 times about it, but what do you think about Pete Rose in the Hall of Fame?
I did a book with Pete Rose.
I know.
We had so much fun.
What year was that you wrote it? What year? I mean, after he played? Or?
It's a very good question. If I went to my bookshelf and pulled it out, I could tell you, but I mean, you could Google it and find it. Pete Rose on hitting.
Okay.
But he loved baseball. He loved women, and he was a gambler.
Right.
Those are the 3 things he liked. And one afternoon, he comes and shows me. He must have showed me 50 tickets from the racetrack. So I said to him, what in the world is that? He says, well, my buddy and I bet $100,000 on the pick 6. So you've got to pick the winners of the first 6 races at whatever racetrack it was in Cincinnati.
Okay.
And he knew that the jockeys and the trainers well enough that they were very sure of 3 of the races. So what they did with the other 3 races is they bought a ticket for each one of the other horses in all 3 of those races.
Okay.
And they bet $100,000 on this. I mean, this is incredible. And so the next day, he comes in with a big grin on his face. He and his buddy won the pick 6. They won $40,000. So that's when I had an inkling that Pete Rose loved to gamble.
Well, it's amazing that I hear he still does for people that kind of in the know a little bit that tell me that he's still, I mean, I guess once you have that, I'll call it a habit. It's hard to lose. You don't lose it.
Gamblers gamble. Pete Rose should be in the Hall of Fame. He was the most important player of his era.
Okay.
No two ways about it. I mean, he gambled while he was a manager, so don't make him don't make him a Hall of Fame manager, but he certainly was a Hall of Fame player.
Right.
And I'll tell you a funny story. I'll tell you another funny story, which wasn't funny at all, was that I went to Louisville to do a book with Paul Hornung. And we sat for 2-3 hours, and he told me magnificent, fantastic stories. And we got an advance of $375,000, and I was supposed to get a third.
Now, that's a lot, right, for a book advance, I imagine, or is that the standard?
Well,
I'm trying to put in perspective what that number is.
It's a lot.
Okay.
Yes, it's a lot. It's a lot. But don't forget, it's Paul Hornung.
Right.
Golden boy, Paul Hornung.
Right.
So he comes to New York to sit with my agent, and he tells my agent, I'll give your guy $20,000, no advances, nothing else, $20,000, take it or leave it.
Mm.
And what happened was, of course, was that Paul, when I was visiting him, after we finished our conversation, he sat in his living room watching horse races.
Mm-hmm.
He must have sat, it was a cable channel of nothing but horse races around the country, and he bet on them, every one.
Mm-hmm.
So he was a gambler. And apparently he decided, instead of giving me my money to write this book, that he would steal my money and gamble with it.
Because you already had an agreement, right? We
had an agreement, but,
right.
Your agreements are only as good as
right.
the person you're doing the agreement with.
Right.
So anyhow, that was that.
Well, most gamblers seem to eventually lose it all, but these guys seem to keep going. I guess Pete must keep making the money with the autographs because, usually that doesn't end up good, if you're a gambler.
It usually doesn't end up good. Well, they either end up in jail or dead.
Right.
And, Pete ended up in jail, which was a terrible thing.
Right. Peter, how are you on time? We're going on 5 o'clock now. Just want to make sure we're okay before I hit my hit and miss pretty soon.
Well, I'm going to Red Mesa Cantina for dinner soon.
Okay. What time are you going? I just want to make sure we wrap up before I don't want to keep you too long.
Well, why don't you go for another 15 minutes? How would that be?
Okay, good. I want to hear about Mickey Mantle, and I got one quick question on one of the things you spoke about earlier, and I'll do my hit and miss word association. You met Mickey Mantle, I assume, correct?
It was one of the great days of my life. Yeah. Mickey had agreed for me to come see him in his home in Dallas. So I got on a plane, flew to Dallas, go to the payphone, and I call his home, and his wife picks up and says, Mickey's in New York. So, okay, get on the plane, back the next day, go to New York, and I'm in the Yankee clubhouse, and Mickey is there wearing his, sort of his cowboy outfit. And I was so sort of cowed by him, mm-hmm. that I asked Elston Howard, who I had interviewed before, if he would introduce me.
Because Mickey was your idol as a kid, I imagine, as every kid probably was.
Absolutely. Okay. You ought to see what my office looks like. If you had that camera thing going, I could have showed it to you.
Oh, okay.
And so Mickey knew I was coming.
Mm-hmm.
Hell, he introduced me. We shook hands. I said, "Do you mind if I ask you a couple of questions, Mick?" And he looks at me and he goes, "No."
Okay, he doesn't mind.
Then he bursts out laughing. And then we sit in the corner of the Yankee clubhouse and talk for about an hour.
Wow. Okay.
And it was absolutely stunning.
Mm.
He had retired in 1968. This was 1973 or 4. And he was telling me about his nightmares. That he would be sleeping and he would be dreaming that he could hear Bob Shepard, who was the PA announcer, and he would be hearing Shepard saying, "Now batting, number 7, Mickey Mantle." And Mickey, in his dream, would be outside of Yankee Stadium and unable to find the door to get in.
Okay.
And he would wake up in a cold sweat.
That was like a recurring dream he had?
That was a recurring dream that he had that he told me about.
Yeah. And
obviously, not obviously, but it was interesting because he had never told anybody else his story.
Right.
It's in Dynasty.
Okay.
And it was remarkable. And the thing that I came to understand about Mickey was that he really didn't understand why people thought he was so special. His father had been abusive. Casey Stengel had been abusive. And so he had very low self-esteem, which is amazing for a guy who was absolutely adored by so many people.
I met him once at Mickey Mantle's, and he gave off that lack of self-esteem a little bit. I think he was drinking when I met him in '88. You know, it wasn't as big as I would have thought. And I was like, you know, there's something there. You know, I was able to pick it up.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. That's so. I've written one novel, and my one novel is called Seven. And what it is the story that Mickey Mantle would have written, the autobiography that Mickey Mantle would have written had he had the balls to do it.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So it's really, Seven is really a very accurate account of who he was.
Okay.
And a lot of the right wing media really, dumped on it. How can you say such things about our hero? That kind of thing.
Right.
They didn't want to hear it.
They didn't want to hear the truth.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. But let's get into our hit and miss word association. First word that comes to your mind. You ready? Ready for
I
this?
guess so.
Okay. It's not too hard.
Sure.
What is your favorite color?
My favorite color?
Yeah. Have you ever been asked that before?
How about blue?
Okay. Now, if you were in a foxhole, other than any family members, who would be in the foxhole with you?
If I was in a foxhole, you mean this is in a war?
Yeah,
a foxhole is...
a little figuratively speaking, but yeah, a foxhole in the wall, someone you trust, or however you think of it. Who would you want in the foxhole with you?
Billy Martin.
Oh, wow. Okay. I wouldn't think of him. Was he a loyal guy?
He was just tough as nails.
Tough as nails. Okay.
You had to be loyal to him.
Okay. And then, he always fascinated me because I know he liked Munson a lot. I was fascinated by their relationship. That I know he respected Munson a lot, and that always I found that interesting for some reason. But Billy didn't like Steinbrenner, correct?
I'd say he probably hated him.
Okay,
as he should have.
Okay,
as he should have. I mean, that was one of the books that I wrote. It was called Wild, High, and Tight,
right?
Which was a biography of Billy Martin, and I knew a lot of people in the Yankee organization and found out what the heck was going on behind the scenes. Steinbrenner was just a lunatic. Steinbrenner was a really, really bad person. He gets credit because he was always had his headlines in the newspapers. But believe it or not, we just had a president who did the exact same thing, who was also a lunatic and a terrible person. In fact, the two of them were close friends. That's what I found so amazing.
Now, that's interesting. That is that touched in the books. I got to read it because you hear the players liked him, and then he was tough, but he was like you hear that
they
side.
Billy. The players love Billy. Are you kidding?
Okay. No, I mean
Billy
Steinbrenner.
Steinbrenner.
The people seem to have a little respect for him, and I haven't heard your side that he was this terrible person. It's just interesting to hear that.
Terrible. He was a terrible person.
Okay.
He was somebody who loved to fire people the same way Trump liked to fire people.
Okay, he got a kick.
Do you know how many managers he had? Do you know how many general managers Steinbrenner had? Do you know PR guys that Steinbrenner had? How many secretaries Steinbrenner had? You think all these people were incompetent? No. The one who was incompetent was Steinbrenner.
Okay.
Steinbrenner, had he not been suspended from baseball twice, never would have won a pennant.
Why would he never win a pennant then?
Because he was an idiot. He enjoyed trading away all the rookie kids that he had for names. He wanted names.
Right.
You remember on Seinfeld when Steinbrenner's character comes to visit George Costanza's father to tell him that George had died? What's the first thing Costanza's father said to him? Mr. Steinbrenner, why did you trade Jay Buhner?
Okay. That sums it up, the way he was?
That sums it up.
Okay. Wow. Okay. This is good stuff because I like hearing the straight stories. So that's why I appreciate all these points of view. I mean, thanks, Peter, for sharing that there. Favorite movie?
It would have to either be Godfather, Apocalypse Now, Galaxy Quest.
Okay. What was your favorite part in the Godfather? Curious what the favorite part was.
Part of the Godfather?
Do you have a favorite part in it, or one of your favorite parts? You know, the horse and the guy's
I think
bed.
The whole thing was just absolutely mesmerizing.
Mm-hmm.
It was mesmerizing from the beginning to the end, and you can watch that movie 100 times. Mm-hmm. And when you start, you're switching channels, and there it is.
You got to keep it on.
And you can't turn away. You don't say, "Hey, I got to go do something." You sit there until the goddamn thing is finished.
Right. Every second, you know, it's
every second. Yeah. It's just the most magnificent movie. It's just unbelievable.
Favorite actor? I got a couple more.
Well, I did a book with Tony Curtis, which was so much fun. So, as a favorite actor, he's certainly one of them. We had so much time, so much fun doing that book together. It was just wonderful.
And he was a great-looking guy in the 50s, wasn't he? He was pretty.
50s,
he had some
60s, 70s, 80s.
He was all the way through.
He was a good-looking guy until he died. Yeah.
Okay.
He was something.
I was touched by. I saw interviews with him when his son died young, and I know he kept his son's shoes with him. So I was always touched by that scene. That he really, I don't know, the way he related to his young son. That passed away. It was kind of touching. It gives me little goosebumps thinking about it.
When did this happen?
Well, maybe I got it wrong. I didn't he have a son that died young?
He had a bunch of kids, but he never knew where any of them were.
Okay. You know what? Now I got to check it out.
He had Jamie Lee Curtis and a sister, and he certainly knew where they were. But Tony was funny because every time his wife would have children, he sort of got mad because the wife would pay more attention to the children than they would to him, and that's why he went off and found another wife.
Oh,
so
okay.
I don't.
Okay.
I'm not.
Maybe I'm imagining this. I just had this memory of him talking about it.
Yeah, I think you're imagining.
I might be wrong.
He had no idea where his sons even were.
Okay. Scratch that. Yeah. Wow. I don't know what I was thinking of there. I'll keep this in though because why not? One wish in the world. I'm a genie, Peter. I'm going to grant you this wish tomorrow. What would your one wish be?
Oh, it's always the same. It's for health.
Okay.
Good health.
Yep.
Yeah.
And how about if you had to meet one person in the world, other than any, biblical figures, tomorrow, I'm going to let you meet this person, alive or dead. You can meet this lady or man. Who would it be?
I don't have the slightest idea.
Okay.
I don't know.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
That's good.
I can't even come up with with who it might be. I don't know.
Is there someone that was the most? You met a lot of people. Anyone that's particularly impressive? That this was so impressive. The one most impressive person you ever met.
The baseball commissioner, whose son is the actor. What's his name?
Uberu?
He died shortly after.
Giamatti, that it?
Yeah, Giamatti.
Yeah. Okay.
Giamatti was a fascinating guy.
Mm-hmm.
He was very, very interesting. And if you've ever read his book on baseball, you begin to see just how much the guy loved the game.
Right.
Which I always admired about this guy. He was one sharp cookie. He was the president of Yale before he became the commissioner of baseball. He was quite amazing.
He was tough on Rose too, right?
Well, I think he screwed Rose, if you want to know the truth.
Okay.
What happened was he made a deal with Rose where he had agreed in the writing of it anyway not to say that Rose had bet on baseball. And so he had a press conference, and the first question was, did Pete Rose bet on baseball? And Giamatti said yes. So I don't know.
Okay. All right, one more hit and miss. Then we'll wrap it up. What's the best advice you ever received or that you would give to somebody?
I think the best advice would be to be kind.
Okay. Simple. Just be kind.
Yeah. Be kind.
Yeah. And I've been thinking about this, Peter, since we spoke early in our conversation, and I was surprised, but I appreciate you bringing it up because, you hear Jim Valvano and then, that big speech he gave, and he seems to be this beloved guy.
Yeah,
and
never give up, never give in.
You never give up, but you had a different take on him. Can you just give me a couple, clips on that? On he was not a great guy, it sounds.
Well, basically, he cheated.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he cheated like nobody's business. He cheated. He also, the thing I didn't like about him more than anything else was that he treated some of his players terribly. He would promise 3 players that if they came to NC State, they would start. And you can't do that. You can't promise 3 people if you come to NC State, you'll be the starting, shooting guard, for instance.
Right.
Because only one of them can, and the other 2 end up sitting on the bench and
okay. So,
I had players who I interviewed who had left NC State and went to other schools who would sit with me and cry their eyes out. Big hulking 6'9" people just weeping about the way he treated them.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. I know.
Yeah. Interesting stuff. You just never know, I guess, what goes on,
Well, that's the fun of it. When you go see somebody, you never know.
You never know. Where do you see sports next year, Peter? I know no one knows, of course, with this pandemic, but what do you think happens? This same repeat of this year?
There'll be shots that you can get so to keep you from getting it, and when everybody gets their shots, the world will go back to normal, and the world will go back to normal. The Yankees will go back to winning probably.
Mm-hmm. In 1917, it seemed like they didn't stop then, right? I mean, I think how history repeats it, but back then, during that pandemic, which might even been worse than this one, they still played baseball, right? Didn't everything just keep going back then?
I think they may have cut it short for the war.
Oh, okay.
Don't forget there was World War I back there too. They may have cut back one of the seasons by a little bit because of the war. You'll have to Google it.
Okay. Well, Peter, I really appreciate you coming out and sharing all these great stories. We look forward to your next book. Is that one you were talking about earlier this year going to come out next year, do you think?
Well, I've got a book coming out in the spring called Whispers of the Gods. It's going to be a sequel to The Glory of Their Times, Larry Ritter's classic book.
Okay.
These are interviews I've done with Hall of Fame ball players and other greats.
Wow.
All of whom have since died. But I think people will get a kick out of it. Stan Musial, Monty Irvin, Roy Campanella, and so forth.
Do you pick the titles for the books too? Just curious how that works.
Yeah, I pick the titles.
Okay.
They're my titles.
All right.
Except for one title. I was going to call the book that I did with Sparky Lyle As the Clubhouse Turns, which I think is a pretty good title to begin with.
Right.
But my editor comes to me one day and he says, I think I have a better title. And I said to him, what's that? He says, The Bronx Zoo.
Okay. He hit the home run with that title, right?
He hit the home run with that title. That's for sure. That is absolutely for certain. Yep.
That is the great Peter Golenbock. I am Ray Kay, and we'll catch you next time.
Thank you for tuning into this episode of New HD NYC. Please remember to rate, review, and subscribe to our show on your favorite podcast platform.